What if the world you inherited was never truly built for you? What if the first humans did not rise from nothing, but arrived late, walking among abandoned systems, broken symbols, and silent monuments whose original purpose had already been forgotten? Across ancient tablets and scattered myths, there are whispers of beings who ruled, organized, and then vanished, leaving humanity to manage the remains. Tonight, we will move slowly through those whispers. Before you grow too comfortable, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if what I'm building here truly resonates with you. And if you feel inclined, share your location and local time in the comments. Now, settle in and continue this long journey with historic sleep, where unanswered questions are allowed to rest beside you in the dark. There is a quiet discomfort that settles in when we look closely at the earliest traces of human civilization. Not awe, not pride, but a subtle sense of arriving late to something already in motion. The first cities do not appear tentative. They do not resemble experiments or crude beginnings. They rise with an unsettling confidence. Organized streets, standardized bricks, irrigation canals that assume long familiarity with water and soil. It is as if humanity stepped into a world whose instructions had already been written, even if the authors were no longer present. Archaeology often speaks in layers. Below each settlement lies another, and beneath that, another still. Yet the deeper we dig, the less primitive things sometimes appear. In Mesopotamia, the oldest urban centers emerge with administrative systems intact. Accounting tokens, seals, and numerical notation, already refined enough to manage surplus, labor, and time itself. These are not the tools of beginners. They suggest inheritance rather than invention. Sumerian texts do not describe humanity as architects of the world, but as workers placed within it. The land was measured before humans tilled it. The rivers were named before cities rose along their banks. In the tablets, the gods do not marvel at creation. They administer it. They assign roles, distribute territories, establish boundaries. Humans appear not as pioneers, but as caretakers, learning to operate a system whose original design logic has already faded from view. This creates a tension that history rarely addresses directly. If civilization was built step by step, why do its earlier steps already resemble a stride? Why does agriculture appear fully formed across multiple regions, with no clear transitional phase from wild harvesting to systematic cultivation? Why does astronomical knowledge surface already aligned with long cycles, as if observation had been ongoing for generations beyond recorded memory? Even the language of origin feels strangely incomplete. Early myths rarely begin with humanity discovering fire or shaping tools. Instead, they begin with arrival. The gods descend, the land is prepared, kingship is lowered from the heavens. These phrases are often dismissed as metaphor, yet they persist across cultures with remarkable consistency. They imply a transfer, not a birth. Stone structures deepen the unease. Megalithic sites around the world show signs of planning that exceeds immediate necessity. Their scale suggests foresight beyond survival. Their alignments speak to a sky watched patiently over long spans of time. Yet the cultures historically credited with inheriting these sites often describe themselves as repairers, restorers, or late occupants. Not original builders. The stones were already there, the knowledge to move them was already lost. This is where the idea of inheritance becomes difficult to ignore. Inherited objects carry traces of their makers, even when their function is misunderstood. A broken machine still reveals intention through its complexity. Likewise, early human civilization seems surrounded by remnants of systems that continue to function partially, even after their guiding intelligence is gone. Agriculture feeds, calendars regulate, social hierarchies persist. But the deeper logic, the reason these systems exist in the first place, remains obscure. Ancient texts hint at this gap repeatedly. The gods withdraw, they retreat to the heavens. They depart after teaching humans the ways of civilization. What remains is not chaos, but maintenance. Humans are left to preserve, repeat, and ritualize actions whose original purpose has become symbolic rather than practical. Over time, symbols harden into traditions. Traditions become laws. Laws become truths. There is also an emotional residue in these stories. A quiet grief that is rarely emphasized. The gods are mourned not only as rulers, but as absent overseers. Humanity is described as noisy, confused, or forgetful without them. This is not the language of empowerment. It is the language of abandonment. Civilization continues, but with a lingering sense that something essential has been removed. From a modern perspective, this discomfort is often resolved through linear progress narratives. We assume complexity must grow over time, yet the archaeological record does not always cooperate. In some cases, later societies appear less capable than their predecessors, not more. Techniques vanish. Precision declines. Writing systems simplify. Knowledge narrows instead of expanding. This is not evolution, it is fragmentation. If we entertain the possibility that humanity inherited a partially functioning world, this fragmentation begins to make sense. Without full understanding of the original systems, only the most visible components would survive. Ritual would outlast engineering. Myth would replace instruction. Meaning would erode while structure remained. Over generations, humans would believe they built what they merely occupied. This perspective does not require believing in literal gods walking among humans. It only requires acknowledging that advanced systems can exist independently of their current users. A city does not explain itself to its inhabitants. A tool does not teach its maker's philosophy. Inheritance is silent. It offers function without context. What remains unsettling is how often ancient cultures seem aware of this silence. Their myths are not triumphant. They are anxious. They speak of lost ages, forgotten names, and knowledge deliberately withheld. They warn of cycles, worlds renewed, civilizations reset, memory erased. These warnings feel less like fantasy and more like attempts to preserve the awareness that something has already been lost. In this light, early humanity appears not as a bold creator, but as a careful listener, trying to interpret echoes. Civilization becomes an act of translation rather than invention. Humans build, yes, but they build upon foundations whose origins they do not fully grasp. The world functions but no longer explains itself. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. If we are inheritors rather than originators, then history as we tell it is incomplete by design. It begins after something ends. It describes continuity without acknowledging interruption. And if that interruption was deliberate, whether by natural catastrophe or by a withdrawing intelligence, then forgetting may not be accidental. The question that lingers is not whether humanity rose, but what it rose into. A blank landscape would have demanded experimentation. Instead, the earlier civilizations display compliance, alignment with systems already in place, calendars respected, lands divided, roles assigned. The machinery of civilization was already humming softly in the background. Perhaps this is why so many ancient traditions emphasize humility, not as moral virtue, but as survival instinct. To inherit something powerful without understanding it is to live cautiously. To preserve rituals whose origins are unknown is to admit dependency. Humanity may have learned early on that the world it occupied was not entirely its own. And if that is true, then the silence at the beginning of history is not empty. It is occupied by absence, the kind that leaves structures standing, systems running, and questions unanswered. Questions that do not demand immediate resolution, but quietly wait, buried beneath the assumption that everything has always belonged to us. What survives from the earliest written records is not a story of creation, but of management. When the first clay tablets were pressed into shape along the rivers of southern Mesopotamia, they did not ask where the world came from. They recorded how it was run. Grain allocations, labour assignments, ritual calendars, lists of names and titles that imply hierarchy long before explanation. In these records, the Anunnaki do not behave like distant, unknowable deities. They function more like administrators whose authority is assumed rather than justified. The discomfort deepens when we notice what is missing. There are no extended philosophical debates about the nature of the gods, no confusion about who holds power. The texts read as if everyone already knows the chain of command. Instructions are given, tasks are delegated. Cities are founded under direction, not inspiration. Humanity does not negotiate its role, it receives it. The Anunnaki appear not as creators shaping matter from nothing, but as figures who arrive to organize what already exists. They measure land, define borders, regulate time, and establish laws that govern both gods and humans. Their authority is bureaucratic rather than mystical. They convene councils, they argue, they vote. Decisions are recorded as outcomes, not revelations. This alone sets them apart from later theological frameworks. In these early accounts, divinity is not infinite or abstract. It is localized, limited, and procedural. The gods reside in specific places. They travel, they sleep, they grow tired. They are bound by rules older than themselves. This is not myth as metaphor. It reads more like documentation filtered through ritual language. Humanity's position within this system is telling. Humans are repeatedly described as labourers, caretakers, and assistants. They are fashioned to relieve the gods of work, not to worship endlessly but to maintain operations. Agriculture, construction, and resource extraction are framed as divine burdens transferred downward. Humanity is introduced into an existing economy. There is an unsettling practicality to this arrangement. Creation myths often celebrate humanity as the centre of existence. Here, humans are supplementary, useful, replaceable. Their value lies in compliance, not creativity. Even kingship is presented not as human ambition, but as delegated authority, borrowed power meant to mirror divine order on earth. The language used to describe this transfer is precise. Kingship is lowered from the heavens. Laws are given, not discovered. Knowledge flows in one direction. When humans innovate, it is often portrayed as error or rebellion rather than progress. The implication is clear. Deviation threatens stability. This framing raises a question history tends to avoid. Why would early civilizations imagine their gods as managers rather than creators? Why structure the divine world like an administration, complete with ranks, jurisdictions, and penalties? Such imagery does not emerge naturally from awe. It emerges from observation. One explanation is psychological, that humans project familiar social structures onto the cosmos. Yet the problem with this reasoning is timing. These texts appear at the very beginning of recorded social complexity. The bureaucracy seems to precede the metaphor, not the other way around. The gods are not shaped like kings because kings exist. Kings exist because gods already ruled that way. Even the conflicts among the Anunnaki feel less like cosmic battles and more like institutional disputes. Authority is contested. Responsibilities are redistributed. Some gods resist assignments, others withdraw. Decisions are justified through precedent. The system bends but does not collapse. Order must be preserved at all costs. What happens when that order begins to strain is where the narrative shifts. The texts speak of noise, humanity becoming too numerous, too disruptive. The gods grow irritated, not morally offended. The response is not punishment for sin, but population control. Floods, droughts, and plagues are tools, not judgments. They are corrective measures. This language reframes catastrophe as policy. A reset, not a reckoning. And within these accounts, the flood is not the end of the world, but a recalibration. Certain humans are warned. Knowledge is preserved selectively. Afterward, the system resumes, though altered. Some gods depart. Others reduce their involvement. Humanity is left with memory fragments rather than instructions. This withdrawal marks a turning point. The texts begin to change tone. The Anunnaki become less present, more symbolic. Ritual replaces interaction. Temples preserve names long after their functions are forgotten. The administrative system remains, but its upper levels are empty. What follows is not collapse, but inheritance without oversight. Humanity continues the routines it was taught. Calendars are maintained, offerings are made, laws are enforced. But the reason behind them grows increasingly opaque. Authority persists, but accountability fades. The gods no longer answer. Over time, the memory of direct governance transforms into theology. Stories replace records. Metaphor overtakes procedure. The Anunnaki become less like supervisors and more like cosmic ancestors. Their earlier pragmatism is softened. Their conflicts become moralized. Their absence is reinterpreted as transcendence. Yet traces of the original framework remain embedded in the structure of civilization itself. Hierarchy, obedience, sacred law, the assumption that order originates elsewhere and must be preserved rather than questioned. These are not abstract ideas, they are operational principles inherited alongside agriculture and writing. If humanity inherited a world once ruled by others, then the earliest myths may not be fantasies at all, but degraded memories of governance. Not gods in the modern sense, but authorities whose nature no longer fits our categories. The Anunnaki, in this view, are not answers. They are placeholders, names assigned to something that once functioned, then vanished. This does not require believing the texts literally. It requires recognizing that myths often preserve structure, even when meaning erodes. The administrative tone, the labor emphasis, the withdrawal narrative, all suggest a civilization remembering control without understanding its source. What lingers most is not fear, but uncertainty. The gods leave, but the system remains. Humanity is left alone with tools it did not design, rules it did not author, and a world that continues to operate without explanation. The Anunnaki fade into silence, but their architecture of order still frames human life. And perhaps that is the most unsettling inheritance of all. Not the memory of rulers, but the persistence of a system that no longer reveals who built it, or why it still demands obedience. There is a silence at the centre of human origins that feels deliberate. Not an absence of evidence, but a narrowing, like a corridor that suddenly closes just as it should widen. When we trace the development of agriculture, mathematics, writing, and astronomy, we do not find a gradual ascent from simplicity to mastery. Instead, we encounter sudden appearances, systems already mature, as though the earliest pages of the manual have been removed. Agriculture is often described as humanity's first great invention, yet its emergence resists the logic of experimentation. Across distant regions, Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus Basin, the Yellow River, complex farming systems appear within remarkably short spans of time. Domesticated plants are already optimized. Irrigation networks are planned. Seasonal calendars align with celestial cycles. There is little archaeological trace of failure, of trial and error, of generations spent learning what not to do. The same pattern repeats in mathematics. Numerical systems do not begin with crude tallies and slowly evolve. In Sumer, we encounter a sexagesimal system capable of complex division and astronomical calculation from the outset. This is not a convenient choice for beginners. It is a system designed for precision, for tracking long cycles, for coordinating labour, time and space. It suggests a need that predates its recorded use. Writing, too, appears strangely self-assured. The earliest scripts are not poetic or narrative. They are administrative. They track resources, obligations and ownership. Writing enters history not as self-expression, but as control. The spoken word becomes fixed because something requires permanence, records that must outlast memory. This need does not arise in small experimental communities. It arises in systems already too complex to manage informally. Astronomy deepens the unease. Early civilizations tracked planetary movements with accuracy that assumes long-term observation. Alignments embedded in architecture reflects knowledge of solstices, equinoxes, and precessional shifts that unfold over centuries. These are not discoveries made within a single lifetime. They are inheritances passed forward, maintained even after their original purpose fades. Mainstream history often explains this by pointing to lost data, organic materials that decayed, early settlements washed away, nomadic phases that left little trace. Yet this explanation feels incomplete. Loss through decay does not usually remove only the beginnings while preserving advanced outcomes. Erosion is indifferent. It destroys randomly. What we see instead is selective absence. Mythology seems aware of this gap. Stories speak of earlier ages, golden ages, ages of gods, times when knowledge flowed freely and humanity lived closer to the source of order. These ages end abruptly. Floods arrive. Fires consume, winds reshape the land. Afterwards, survivors rebuild, but always with reverence toward what came before. The past is not crude, it is sacred. This reverence suggests memory without access. Humanity remembers that something existed, but not how it worked. Knowledge becomes ritualized because ritual preserves form even when function is lost. Songs encode calendars. Ceremonies mark agricultural timing. Temples replicate cosmic order in stone. Over time, these practices continue not because they are understood, but because they are believed to be necessary. The idea of missing origins challenges the narrative of human self-sufficiency. It raises the possibility that humanity's earliest role was not invention, but adaptation, learning to use systems already in place, understanding enough to survive, but not enough to redesign. Progress in this light becomes maintenance under diminishing comprehension. This may explain why so many ancient cultures feared forgetting more than ignorance. To forget was not to lose trivia, but to risk destabilizing reality itself. Knowledge was guarded, restricted, encoded. Initiation replaced education. Only fragments were shared widely, while deeper understanding remained confined, perhaps because even it was incomplete. Over generations, fragments drift apart. A calendar survives without its astronomical rationale. A law persists without its environmental context. A myth remains without its operational meaning. What began as a cohesive system becomes a mosaic of traditions. Humanity adapts, but never quite recovers the original coherence. There is also the question of motivation. Why would such foundational knowledge disappear? Natural catastrophe offers one answer. Floods, ice ages, volcanic winters. These can erase infrastructure quickly. Yet catastrophe alone does not explain why survivors would fail to redevelop foundational insights. Humans are capable of rediscovery, unless rediscovery was constrained. Some myths hint at boundaries placed deliberately, knowledge withheld, access restricted. Humans warned against reaching too far, knowing too much. These warnings are often moralized in later retellings, but their earliest versions feel procedural. Certain knowledge is dangerous, destabilizing, or forbidden. Not because it is evil, but because it disrupts balance. If humanity inherited a world once ruled or structured by others, then missing origins may not be accidental. They may represent the limits of what was passed down. Enough to function, not enough to transcend dependency. A controlled handover rather than a complete transfer. This would cast early civilization as a supervised phase that eventually ended. When supervision withdrew, whether through catastrophe, departure, or deliberate retreat, humanity was left to interpret remnants. Some interpretations proved effective, others ossified into dogma. Over time, the question of origin became philosophical rather than practical. Modern science now circles back to these ancient absences. We ask how agriculture began, why intelligence surged, how symbolic thought accelerated so quickly. Each answer reveals deeper complexity, but also deeper uncertainty. The corridor narrows again. The beginning retreats. Perhaps the discomfort we feel is not because the past is primitive, but because it is unfinished. Civilization did not begin with clarity. It began mid-sentence. Humanity entered a conversation already underway, learned to repeat certain phrases, and gradually forgot who first spoke them. The silence at the start of history may not be empty at all. It may be filled with decisions we no longer remember, systems we continue to use, and questions that were never meant to be answered, only inherited. There is a peculiar language embedded in humanity's oldest stories, one that modern ears often dismiss as metaphor, but ancient minds treated with unsettling precision. It is the language of mixing, of clay blended with essence, of bloodlines altered, of being shaped not merely by nature, but by deliberate intervention. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the same suggestion surfaces quietly. Humanity was modified. In the Sumerian texts, the creation of humans is not an act of spontaneous life-giving. It is a process. Materials are selected. A sacrifice is made. Something divine is combined with something earthly. The result is not perfection, but functionality. Humans are made capable of labour, communication, reproduction. They are designed to serve a role, not to embody an ideal. What is striking is the absence of wonder in these accounts. The act is described clinically, almost reluctantly. The gods argue about responsibility, they weigh consequences. Humanity is introduced as a solution to a problem. Exhaustion, unrest, imbalance within the divine order. This is not the language of mythic poetry. It resembles the logic of engineering. Later traditions echo this theme, though often softened. Humans are shaped from dust and animated by breath. They are formed in the image of higher beings, yet flawed. Mortality is imposed. Knowledge is restricted. Each retelling shifts emphasis, but the underlying structure remains. Humanity is incomplete by design. Modern biology approaches human origins through mutation, selection, and time. Yet even within this framework, there are anomalies that provoke quiet debate. The sudden acceleration of cognitive capacity, the emergence of symbolic thought, the rapid development of language. These changes occur not as a smooth curve, but as punctuated leaps. Explanations exist, but none feel entirely sufficient. Genetics reveals a species marked by bottlenecks, periods where population shrinks dramatically, then rebounds. Such events compress diversity, amplify traits, and accelerate change. But they also erase history. Entire branches vanish, leaving only hints in the genome. What survives appears optimized, yet constrained. Some researchers note that human DNA contains regions of unknown function, sequences conserved across generations without clear purpose. Others point to the remarkable uniformity of humanity compared to other species, as if variation was intentionally limited. These observations do not prove intervention, but they invite speculation that evolution alone may not tell the full story. Ancient myths frame this limitation explicitly. Humans are warned not to eat certain fruits, not to ascend certain mountains, not to speak certain names. Transgression leads to exile, mortality, confusion. Knowledge is depicted not as empowerment, but as destabilization. The boundary is not moral, it is structural. This raises a subtle question. Why would early cultures imagine themselves as constrained? Why invent stories that limit human potential rather than glorify it? Such narratives do not emerge from arrogance, they emerge from memory of restriction. The theme of hybridization appears again and again. Demigods, giants, watchers, beings who walk between realms. These figures often teach humans skills, agriculture, metallurgy, writing, then disappear. Their offspring are unstable, too powerful, or unsustainable. The world cannot support them. Balance requires their removal. Over time, these stories are moralized. Hybrids become monsters. The mixing becomes sin. Yet the earliest layers retain a neutral tone. The act of blending is risky, but not inherently wrong. It simply carries consequences. If humanity inherited a world structured by others, then genetic myths may encode more than symbolism. They may reflect an attempt to explain why humans are capable yet limited, intelligent yet dependent. Why we can understand fragments of cosmic order but never grasp it fully. There is also the recurring idea of guardianship. Knowledge is held by elders, priests, or gods. Access is granted selectively. Initiation replaces discovery. This mirrors the way complex systems are taught, through controlled exposure rather than total transparency. Not all users need to know how the machine works. They only need to operate it correctly. From this perspective, humanity resembles a user interface rather than an architect, designed to interact with the world efficiently, but not to alter its underlying code. Curiosity is allowed within bounds. Beyond them lies chaos. Modern discomfort with these myths may stem from their implications. They suggest that human exceptionalism is conditional, that intelligence was shaped, not purely earned, that our species carries both enhancement and restriction as part of its inheritance. Yet these stories also carry a quiet sadness. Humans are not condemned for curiosity. They are simply unprepared. The loss of access is not framed as punishment alone, but as separation, a closing of a door that once stood open. As centuries pass, the language shifts. Genetic mixing becomes metaphor. Divine essence becomes soul. The memory of modification fades into theology. What remains is the feeling that humanity is unfinished. Caught between animal instinct and something higher, it can sense but not reach. Perhaps this is why questions of origin continue to haunt us. Why we search the genome, the stars, the ruins of ancient cities for confirmation that we are more than accidents of chemistry. The myths do not offer answers. They offer context. They suggest that humanity did not emerge in isolation, but within a framework already defined, that our strengths and limitations are not random but inherited, and that somewhere beneath the layers of story and symbol lies a forgotten understanding of why we are the way we are. If such an understanding once existed, its absence may be the most enduring modification of all. Not written into our genes, but into our memory, stone does not forget easily. Unlike language, unlike bloodlines or rituals, stone preserves effort with brutal honesty. It records weight, precision, and intention. When we stand before the monumental structures of the ancient world, the question that quietly emerges is not how they were built, but why they were built at all, and why their builders seemed unconcerned with leaving explanations behind. Across continents, massive stoneworks appear at the very dawn of civilization. They are not incremental achievements. They do not begin small and grow larger over time. Instead, the earliest examples are often the most ambitious. Later cultures inherit them, imitate them poorly, or dismantle them for material but rarely surpass them. This inversion of expectation unsettles the narrative of continuous progress. Consider the logistics alone. Stones weighing tens, sometimes hundreds of tons, are quarried, transported, and placed with astonishing accuracy. Joints fit so tightly that blades cannot slide between them. Foundations are leveled to tolerances that challenge modern engineering. These feats are accomplished without clear evidence of advanced machinery, written blueprints, or a trial and error phase that would normally precede such mastery. Standard explanations rely on human persistence, ramps, ropes, labour, time. And while these explanations account for possibility, they rarely address efficiency. The methods proposed would require immense organisation, long-term planning, and a surplus of resources beyond mere survival. Such conditions presuppose an already stable, well-managed society. The monuments appear not as the cause of civilization, but as products of something already established. Even more perplexing is placement. Many of these structures occupy locations that serve no immediate defensive or domestic purpose. They align instead with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, star risings. Some mirror constellations. Others interact with sound, light, and vibration in ways that feel deliberate rather than incidental. These are not shelters, they are instruments. Yet the cultures historically associated with these sites often describe themselves as inheritors. Later inscriptions speak of restoration, reverence, and reuse. Myths insist the stones were set by gods or giants, not humans. Modern interpretation dismisses these claims as symbolic, but symbolism does not explain why builders would attribute their greatest achievements to others, unless memory of authorship was already unclear. There is also the matter of technique. Many ancient stoneworks display methods that disappear rather than evolve. Precision masonry gives way to rougher construction. Monumental ambition fades, skills are lost. This is not typical of technological development. Knowledge tends to accumulate. Here it fractures. One possible explanation is catastrophe. A flood, an earthquake, a climatic shift could disrupt societies and scatter populations, taking specialists with them. But catastrophe alone does not explain why later generations would fail to rediscover methods if they were purely mechanical. Stone is forgiving. Errors teach quickly. Yet centuries pass and the same precision is not replicated. This suggests that the missing element was not strength or ingenuity, but understanding. The monuments may have relied on principles that are not obvious: acoustic resonance, harmonic alignment, geological awareness. These are not intuitive tools. They require theoretical frameworks as much as physical effort. Some researchers have proposed that ancient builders understood stone not as inert matter, but as responsive, that certain frequencies could reduce friction, alter weight perception, or stabilize structures. While such ideas remain controversial, they are not entirely speculative. Modern physics acknowledges that vibration influences material behavior. What remains unknown is whether ancient cultures applied this knowledge intentionally. Mythology again offers hints: stones that sing, walls that move at command, structures raised by sound or speech. These stories are often dismissed as fantasy, yet they persist across regions where monumental stone architecture is found. The myths may not describe literal events, but they may preserve memory of techniques that no longer translate easily into modern terms. If humanity inherited a world shaped by others, then monumental architecture may represent anchor points, physical reminders of a previous order. Not homes, but markers, signals embedded in the landscape. Their endurance suggests they were meant to outlast generations, perhaps even civilizations. What complicates matters is the lack of clear functional explanation. These structures do not obviously serve agriculture, defense, or habitation. Their utility lies elsewhere, in synchronization, in observation, in regulation. They organize human activity around time, space, and ritual. They impose order without explanation. This aligns with the idea of inheritance without instruction. Humanity may have been taught to maintain these sites, not to build them from scratch. Over time, maintenance becomes imitation. Imitation becomes tradition. Tradition becomes mystery. The stones remain, but their purpose dissolves into symbolism. Sacredness replaces function. The monument becomes a temple, then a ruin, then a tourist site. Each layer of interpretation moves further from original intent. Yet the stones themselves do not change. Their precision remains. Their alignments still mark the sky. Their presence continues to challenge assumptions about who built them and why. They stand as evidence not of ancient ignorance, but of ancient capability that does not fit comfortably within our models. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not that humans could not build these structures, but that they may not have needed to understand them fully. Like users operating a system designed by others, early societies could interact with monumental architecture effectively without grasping its underlying principles. If that is the case, then these stone giants are not achievements of a beginning civilization, but remnants of an ending one. Not monuments to human ascent, but to something that came before and withdrew, leaving behind structures that still shape our movement, our myths, and our sense of the possible. Stone does not forget. It waits. And in its silence, it preserves questions that have not yet found language. There is an unease that arises when ancient structures are approached not as symbols, but as systems. When we stop asking what they meant and begin asking what they did, the familiar explanations begin to thin. Stone in these contexts behaves less like decoration and more like a medium. Walls curve where echoes gather. Chambers amplify whispers into resonance. Corridors guide sound with a precision that feels intentional. These are not accidents of primitive building. They suggest an understanding of energy that predates our modern vocabulary for it. In many ancient sites, sound behaves strangely. A footstep triggers vibration across distant chambers. A low hum causes walls to respond. Voices carry farther than expected, bending around corners, lingering where silence should fall. Such effects are often dismissed as curiosities, yet they recur with consistency across cultures that had no contact with one another. This repetition implies design rather than coincidence. Sound is a form of energy, and energy is movement shaped by constraint. Modern physics acknowledges that vibration influences matter at the molecular level. Frequency can alter structure, reduce friction, induce coherence. These principles are not speculative, they are observable. What remains uncertain is how long humans have known them. Ancient myths repeatedly associate sound with creation and control. Words shape reality, names hold power, music calms chaos, trumpets collapse walls, chants open gates. In later retellings, these motifs become symbolic, but in their earliest forms, they are procedural. Sound is used, not admired. It is applied. Stone architecture appears to respond to this application. Certain materials, granite, limestone, basalt, possess piezoelectric properties. Under pressure or vibration, they generate electrical charge. This does not mean ancient builders understood electricity as we define it, but it suggests they may have recognized effects without formal theory. Observation often precedes explanation. If stone was selected not only for durability, but for responsiveness, then monuments may have functioned as resonant devices, structures tuned to the earth itself, to seismic rhythms, to atmospheric pressure, to celestial cycles that subtly influence gravity and vibration. In this context, architecture becomes interface. This reframes the question of ancient energy. Instead of asking how people generated power, we might ask how they interacted with it. The Earth is not static. It hums, it shifts, it emits frequencies we now measure but rarely feel. A civilization attuned to these rhythms might design structures to amplify or stabilize them. Not to dominate nature, but to synchronize with it. Such synchronization would not resemble modern machinery. It would leave few moving parts, few residues, no exhaust. What remains would be stone-shaped to guide forces we only recently began to quantify. To later observers, stripped of context, these structures would appear excessive, ceremonial, or irrational. This may explain why later cultures struggled to replicate earlier feats. Without understanding the energetic principles involved, imitation would focus on visible form rather than invisible function. The result would look similar, but behave differently. Precision would decline, resonance would vanish, the structure would stand, but it would no longer work. Ancient texts occasionally hint at this loss. They speak of places where voices once awakened the stones, where rituals sustained balance, where silence followed abandonment. These passages are often interpreted spiritually, yet they may preserve memory of systems that required active participation to remain effective. If humanity inherited such systems, then maintenance would be essential. Not just physical repair, but ritual interaction. Sound, movement, presence. When participation ended, through catastrophe, migration, or cultural shift, the systems would fall dormant, still standing, still precise, but inert. This dormancy could easily be mistaken for symbolism. A place once used for regulation becomes a temple, a device becomes a shrine. Function dissolves into reverence. Over time, the original purpose becomes unthinkable. Only the echo remains. Modern attempts to understand these sites often avoid energetic explanations because they challenge linear narratives. Acknowledging ancient knowledge of sound and resonance does not imply supernatural ability. It implies observation, experimentation, and continuity we are reluctant to grant early civilizations. Yet the evidence is not easily dismissed. Acoustic chambers where a single tone induces altered states of consciousness. Corridors aligned to amplify footsteps into thunder. Stone boxes tuned to frequencies that affect perception. These effects are measurable. They exist regardless of interpretation. What is missing is context. No manuals survive. No explicit instructions. Only structures that respond when interacted with in specific ways, like abandoned instruments waiting for hands that no longer know how to play them. If an earlier order existed, one that understood energy as relationship rather than resource, then sound-based systems would make sense. They would regulate social cohesion, mark time, influence psychology. They would require participation rather than consumption. Such systems do not scale easily. They depend on shared understanding. When that understanding breaks, the system becomes incomprehensible. Later societies, inheriting fragments, would preserve the outer shell while losing the inner logic. They would remember that the place mattered, but not why. That sound was important, but not how. This may also explain why later technological development took a different path. Instead of harmonizing with natural frequencies, humanity pursued control through force, combustion, extraction, mechanical advantage. These methods leave clearer traces. They are easier to replicate without context. They survive for getting better than subtle systems. The loss of sound-based knowledge would not feel like collapse. Life would continue. Crops would grow. Cities would expand. But something quieter would vanish. A layer of interaction with the world that does not announce its absence immediately. Perhaps this is why certain ancient sites still provoke unease. Not because they are mysterious, but because they are incomplete. They hint at a mode of engagement we no longer possess. They respond faintly, but not fully, like echoes in a room whose source has been sealed. If humanity inherited a world once tuned differently, then these stones are not monuments to belief. They are remnants of a conversation between intelligence and environment that ended abruptly. The silence we hear now may not be emptiness, but disuse. And in that silence, the question lingers, not of whether ancient people had advanced technology, but whether they understood something about energy, sound, and matter that we have only begun to rediscover without realizing it was once already known. Across nearly every ancient culture, there exists a memory that does not behave like a moral lesson. It does not reward virtue or punish sin in a clean, comforting way. Instead, it arrives as disruption, sudden, overwhelming, and strangely administrative. The flood does not feel like judgment, it feels like reset. In the earliest flood accounts, the language is technical rather than theological. Waters rise, boundaries dissolve, systems fail. The concern is not guilt, but noise, imbalance, excess. Humanity has grown too numerous, too unpredictable, too difficult to manage. The solution is not persuasion or reform, but erasure, a reduction to manageable scale. This framing appears again and again. In Mesopotamian tablets, the flood is debated among the gods as a logistical necessity. There is disagreement, hesitation, even regret, but not moral outrage. The flood is something that must be done, not something deserved. Survival is selective, not righteous. Knowledge is preserved not because it is sacred, but because it is useful. This distinction matters. Moral floods cleanse the soul of the world. Reset floods recalibrate systems. They do not aim to end civilization permanently. They interrupt it, reshape it, and allow it to resume under altered conditions. Geology complicates the picture further. Evidence of sudden, catastrophic flooding appears in multiple regions, often coinciding with the end of stable climatic periods. Meltwater pulses reshape coastlines. Sea levels rise faster than memory can adapt. River systems overflow beyond historical precedent. For ancient societies, these events would not have felt like local disasters. They would have felt like the rules of the world had changed without warning. For civilizations dependent on inherited systems, agriculture, calendars, monumental infrastructure, such disruption would be devastating. Knowledge that relies on continuity collapses when continuity ends. Measurement loses meaning when landmarks vanish. Ritual fails when seasons shift unpredictably. What survives is not understanding, but fragments. Flood myths emphasize this fragmentation. Survivors cling to remnants, tablets sealed in pitch, seeds stored in darkness, tools carried into uncertainty, songs remembered imperfectly. They rebuild, but always with the awareness that something essential was lost in the waters. The new world resembles the old one only partially. It functions, but with less clarity. The gods are more distant, the rules are harder to read. After the flood, divine involvement diminishes. Humans are granted autonomy, but also burdened with ambiguity. Lifespans shorten. Knowledge narrows. Authority becomes hereditary rather than delegated directly. Civilization continues, but without supervision. If humanity inherited a world structured by others, then the flood marks a transition point. Not the beginning of humanity, but the end of oversight, a moment when systems designed for one level of order were forced to adapt to another. The reset does not erase everything. It leaves behind enough to rebuild, but not enough to fully recover. This explains why post-flood civilizations feel derivative. They remember grandeur, but cannot reproduce it. They preserve rituals, but misunderstand their function. They tell stories of gods who once walked among them, then withdrew beyond reach. The flood becomes the dividing line between presence and absence. It is notable how often flood survivors are warned, instructed, or assisted. Survival is not random. Certain individuals are chosen not for virtue, but for compliance. They listen. They follow instructions. They preserve what they are told to preserve. This suggests continuity of intention rather than divine whim. The flood, then, becomes less an act of destruction and more an enforced transition, a controlled collapse designed to reset complexity without eliminating the experiment entirely. Humanity is allowed to continue, but under narrower constraints. What emerges afterward is a quieter world, fewer monumental projects, less precision, more myth. The silence of absent rulers is filled with interpretation. Gods become symbols. Systems become traditions. Authority becomes abstract. Yet the memory of the reset lingers. Ancient cultures remain haunted by cycles. They expect renewal through destruction. They fear excess. They warn against abundance. These are not moral anxieties, they are systemic ones. Too much growth threatens stability. Too much noise invites correction. Modern interpretations often sanitize these myths, reframing them as cautionary tales about pride or environmental care. but their earliest tone is colder, more procedural. The flood is not punishment for wrongdoing, it is maintenance. This perspective reframes humanity's relationship with catastrophe. Disasters are not always failures of nature or morality. They may be thresholds, points where inherited systems can no longer sustain accumulated complexity. When that happens, reduction becomes inevitable. If this is true, then the flood is not a singular event confined to the mythic past. It is a pattern, a mechanism embedded in the rise and fall of civilizations. The difference is that earlier cultures remembered it consciously. They encoded it into story. They expected it to return. Perhaps this is why flood myths feel less like stories and more like warnings whispered across time. Not warnings of divine anger, but of systemic limits, of worlds that grow too intricate to be managed without intervention. And if humanity truly inherited a world once ruled by others, then the flood may represent the moment that inheritance became unconditional. No more guidance. No more correction beyond catastrophe itself. Just humanity, standing amid receding waters, holding fragments of a system it did not design, tasked with rebuilding, without knowing how many times this had already happened before. After the waters recede, something subtler begins to drain away. It is not land or memory of catastrophe, but presence. The gods do not die in the flood narratives. They withdraw. Their voices grow distant. Their instructions become rare. What remains is not chaos, but a strange continuity, systems still operating, rituals still performed, calendars still kept, now without supervision. Early post-flood texts reflect this shift quietly. The language changes from command to recollection. Where once the gods issued directives, now humans recount what was once done. Authority persists, but it is secondhand. Kings rule by mandate, priests speak on behalf, and law is preserved because it is old, not because it is understood. This is the moment when inheritance becomes burden. A system without its architects becomes brittle. It can be followed, but not revised. It can be obeyed, but not questioned meaningfully. Humanity steps fully into autonomy, yet autonomy arrives incomplete. Freedom without comprehension. The Anunnaki, once administrators, become ancestors. Their roles blur, some names merge. Others are elevated beyond reach. Their former debates and decisions are smoothed into mythic certainty. The bureaucracy of gods transforms into pantheon. Complexity is simplified for preservation. In this transition, something crucial is lost. Feedback. When the system malfunctions, there is no one to ask. Droughts are met with offerings. Plagues with prayer. Structural problems are interpreted as moral ones because technical explanations are no longer accessible. The machinery of civilization continues to turn, but its diagnostics are gone. This absence shapes the psychology of early post-flood societies. Fear replaces confidence. Ritual becomes more rigid. Deviation is punished not because it fails, but because it threatens continuity. The past becomes sacred because it is safer than innovation. What worked once must work again, even if the conditions have changed. Kingship evolves accordingly. Early rulers present themselves not as inventors, but as restorers. They rebuild temples, as in former times. They claim lineage rather than insight. Authority flows backward, not forward. Legitimacy is measured by closeness to origins, not effectiveness. This backward gaze creates a paradox. The more distant the gods become, the more absolute they are portrayed. Their earlier limitations, fatigue, conflict, uncertainty, are erased. Transcendence replaces presence. The gods no longer manage. They judge. Their absence is reframed as perfection. Yet the world does not behave as though it is under perfect oversight. Systems strain. Cities rise and fall. Knowledge fragments further. Each generation inherits less context than the last. The inherited world grows more opaque, not more comprehensible. Priesthoods emerge as intermediaries, attempting to stabilize meaning. They memorize, encode, and ritualize. They guard access to sacred knowledge, not necessarily to control it, but to prevent its dilution. Initiation becomes necessary because understanding's no longer intuitive. What was once operational becomes symbolic. This shift has consequences. Symbols are powerful, but they are also ambiguous. They invite interpretation. competing interpretations arise. Authority fractures. Different cities remember the same gods differently. The system loses uniformity. In response, empires attempt consolidation, standardized laws, unified calendars, official myths. These are efforts to repair fragmentation by force. They impose coherence from above, rather than cultivating understanding from within. The inherited system is stabilized temporarily, but at the cost of flexibility. The withdrawal of the gods also alters humanity's relationship with time. Without direct instruction, the future becomes uncertain. Cycles are remembered, but not predicted confidently. Anxiety grows around thresholds, eclipses, comets, solstices. These moments feel like messages that can no longer be decoded reliably. This anxiety fuels prophecy. If the gods no longer speak openly, perhaps they communicate through signs. Meaning is sought in anomalies. Patterns are overread. Fear of another reset lingers beneath cultural memory. Excess is monitored. Noise is discouraged. Growth is tolerated cautiously. The inherited world, once dynamic, becomes fragile. Humanity walks carefully across it, afraid of triggering collapse. Innovation slows not because of lack of imagination, but because the cost of failure feels existential. When the system breaks, it breaks catastrophically. Yet even in this fragility, resilience persists. Humans adapt. They repurpose fragments. They invent within constraints. New forms of art, belief, and governance emerge. Civilization does not end. It transforms, but always with a sense of living inside ruins whose original purpose is forgotten. This may explain why so many cultures imagine a distant return of the gods, a restoration of order, a final instruction. The hope is not for salvation, but for clarification, to understand what the world was meant to be. Modernity inherits this longing unconsciously. We search for grand theories, unifying laws, ultimate explanations. We build sciences and systems to replace what was lost. In doing so, we recreate the pattern, constructing complex frameworks that may one day outlast our understanding of them. If humanity inherited a world once ruled by others, then the post-flood era marks the beginning of a long solitude. Not abandonment in anger, but in silence. The system remains, the guidance does not. And so humanity learns to live with echoes, to maintain structures without manuals, to follow rules whose origins are obscured. The withdrawal is not dramatic. It is gradual, almost gentle. But its effects are profound. A world once administered becomes a world interpreted. An interpretation, unlike instruction, never fully resolves. It only deepens the mystery of why the world continues to function at all, long after those who shaped it stepped away. When the gods recede, authority does not vanish with them. It settles. It pools. It finds new vessels. In the long aftermath of withdrawal, humanity does not abandon hierarchy. It inherits it. Kings rise not as creators of order, but as custodians of something older, something already sanctified by distance and memory. Early kingship carries a distinct tone of unease. Rulers do not claim wisdom of their own, they claim transmission. Power is not earned through insight, but bestowed through lineage, omen, or ritual confirmation. The king is not the source of law, he is its echo. His legitimacy depends on proximity to what came before, not on his capacity to innovate. This framing is consistent across early civilizations. Authority is vertical, not horizontal. It descends. It is granted, lowered, anointed. Even rebellion rarely challenges the concept of kingship itself. It challenges who is worthy to hold it. The structure remains unquestioned because it is believed to predate humanity. Priesthoods emerge alongside kings, not in opposition, but in reinforcement. Where kings embody inherited authority, priests preserve inherited knowledge. They memorize rituals whose original purpose has dimmed. They maintain calendars whose logic is partially obscured. They guard texts that no longer explain themselves fully. Their power lies not in understanding, but in continuity. This division of roles stabilizes the inherited system, but it also freezes it. Kings act, priests interpret, neither redesigns. Innovation becomes dangerous because it threatens alignment with origins. Change is tolerated only when it can be framed as restoration. Over time, this creates a subtle inversion. The farther humanity moves from the gods, the more absolute divine authority becomes. Early texts describe gods who argue, hesitate, and make mistakes. Later traditions portray perfection. Flaws are edited out. Ambiguity becomes heresy. Distance idealizes. This idealization serves a purpose. In a world without direct guidance, certainty must be manufactured. Absolute gods provide psychological stability even as practical understanding fades. The more opaque the system becomes, the more rigid belief must grow to compensate. Law evolves under this pressure. Early laws read like adjustments, contextual, situational, flexible. Later codes harden. They are carved into stone. They claim eternal validity. Their authority derives not from effectiveness, but from antiquity. To question the law is to question the cosmos. Yet cracks appear. Different regions remember the same gods differently. Calendars drift. Rituals diverge. Interpretations multiply. The inherited system fragments along cultural lines, each claiming fidelity to the original while diverging further from it. Empires arise as attempts to repair this fragmentation. They standardize belief. They unify law. They impose official histories. In doing so, they suppress local memory in favor of centralized narrative. The goal is not truth, but coherence. This process often involves deliberate forgetting. Texts are edited, contradictions removed, gods merged or demoted. What does not fit the imperial framework is labeled primitive, dangerous, or false. History is streamlined for governance. Ironically, this makes the inherited system even more fragile. By erasing ambiguity, empires lose adaptability. When conditions change, rigid systems fail catastrophically. Collapse follows, leaving behind ruins and unanswered questions. After each collapse, the pattern repeats. New rulers claim ancient mandate. New priesthoods guard partial knowledge. Each iteration drifts further from the source while insisting greater fidelity. Memory becomes myth. Myth becomes doctrine. This repetition suggests that kingship itself may be an inherited technology, a mechanism for maintaining order in the absence of original architects. It works well enough to stabilize societies, but not to restore lost understanding. It preserves structure, not insight. The emotional cost of this arrangement is subtle but persistent. Humanity grows accustomed to obedience without explanation. Authority becomes something external, unquestionable. Responsibility is displaced upward, toward gods who no longer respond. This displacement shapes culture deeply. When systems fail, blame ascends. When disasters strike, meaning is sought in punishment or prophecy. Technical failure becomes moral failure because technical understanding is no longer accessible. Yet beneath obedience, unease persists. Stories circulate of hidden knowledge, of lost books, of golden ages when kings ruled justly because they understood the will of the gods directly. These stories are not nostalgia, they are symptoms of disconnection. Even revolutions rarely escape this framework. New regimes claim truer alignment with origins. They promise restoration rather than reinvention. The inherited system remains the reference point, even when rejected. If humanity inherited a world once ruled by others, then kingship is not merely political. It is compensatory. It fills a vacuum left by withdrawal. It attempts to localize authority that was once external and unquestionable. But compensation is not replacement. Kings cannot restore what they do not comprehend. Priests cannot explain what they only preserve. Together they maintain a system that continues to function, but without clarity. And so humanity lives within layers of authority stacked atop forgotten foundations. Each layer believes itself closer to truth than the last, even as distance grows. The gods fade into abstraction. Kings become symbols. Law becomes habit. What remains is a civilization proficient at obedience, skilled at preservation, and haunted by the sense that something essential is missing. Not power, but understanding. As centuries pass, inheritance no longer feels like possession. It feels like weight. Knowledge survives, but unevenly, like a shattered mirror, whose fragments reflect different truths depending on where one stands. What once operated as an integrated system now exists as isolated practices, rituals without context, formulas without theory, symbols without explanation. This fragmentation is not sudden. It unfolds quietly, generation by generation. A calendar remains accurate, but the astronomical reasoning behind it fades. A law persists, but the environmental condition that shaped it no longer exists. A monument is revered, but its function is unknown. Each fragment works well enough on its own to justify preservation, even as the larger system dissolves. Writing accelerates this process. Once knowledge is fixed in text, it becomes easier to copy than to understand. Scribes reproduce words long after the situations they describe have vanished. Errors accumulate subtly. Interpretations harden. What was once adaptable becomes canonical. Education shifts accordingly. Instead of training problem solvers, societies train memorizers. The goal's not comprehension, but fidelity. To alter inherited knowledge feels dangerous. Better to repeat than to risk distortion, even when repetition itself distorts over time. This selective survival shapes culture profoundly. Certain forms of knowledge endure because they are easy to ritualize. Others vanish because they depend on context, experimentation, or feedback. Practical astronomy survives through festivals and seasons. Engineering principles fade because they require active application. Psychology persists through myth. Physics disappears into silence. The result is an uneven intellectual landscape. Humanity knows some things very well, and others not at all. The gaps are rarely acknowledged. Instead, they are filled with meaning. Where explanation ends, symbolism begins. Where understanding fails, reverence takes over. Religious frameworks adapt to accommodate this imbalance. Myths grow more elaborate as mechanics fade. Gods absorb functions once attributed to systems. Divine will replaces cause and effect. The unknown becomes intentional rather than accidental. This is not deception, it is coping. A fragmented inheritance demands narrative cohesion. Humans are storytellers by necessity. When systems no longer explain themselves, stories provide continuity. Yet stories also conceal loss. They smooth over absence. They offer emotional resolution where intellectual resolution is impossible. Over time, the difference between what is remembered and what is imagined becomes indistinguishable. This indistinguishability is fertile ground for power. Those who control narrative control meaning. Fragmented knowledge makes central authority attractive. If no one understands the whole, someone must decide what matters. Institutions emerge to manage fragments. Libraries collect texts they cannot fully interpret. Schools teach conclusions without premises. Courts enforce laws whose origins are unknown. Each institution stabilizes society while quietly admitting that understanding has become secondary to order. The irony is subtle. The more fragmented knowledge becomes, the more absolute certainty is demanded. Doubt threatens cohesion. Questioning origins destabilizes legitimacy. Silence becomes virtue. This dynamic echoes the earlier withdrawal of the gods. Once again, guidance fades, and interpretation takes its place. Humanity repeats the pattern on a smaller scale, internalizing what was once external. Authority no longer descends from the heavens. It emerges from institutions built to manage uncertainty. Over time, even the memory of fragmentation fades. The inherited world feels complete because its gaps are normalized. Children grow up learning only what survives. Absence becomes invisible. Soon, yet occasionally, anomalies surface. A text that contradicts doctrine, a ruin that does not fit chronology, a myth that preserves a technical detail no longer explainable. These anomalies feel unsettling not because they are false, but because they hint at missing structure. When anomalies appear, they are often dismissed or absorbed into existing narratives. A contradiction becomes allegory, an error becomes mystery, a challenge becomes heresy. The system protects itself by resisting reintegration. This resistance is not malicious, it is instinctive. Fragmented systems fear wholeness because wholeness demands re-evaluation. Re-evaluation threatens stability. If humanity inherited a world once governed by coherent systems, then fragmentation is not failure. It is entropy. Systems without maintenance degrade predictably. What remains is what is easiest to carry forward, not what is most important. The tragedy lies not in ignorance, but in confidence built on partial memory. Humanity becomes certain about what it remembers and unaware of what it has lost. Progress continues, but direction becomes unclear. Modern science attempts to reverse this process, seeking unification. It builds frameworks to reconnect fragments. Yet it, too, operates within inheritance. It relies on assumptions, instruments, and concepts shaped by earlier choices. It may rediscover principles once known, without recognizing them as such. This creates a strange convergence. Ancient myths and modern equations circle the same questions from opposite ends of forgetting. One preserves meaning without mechanism, the other seeks mechanism without memory. Between them lies a silence, a space where integrated understanding once lived. Whether that space was occupied by gods, advanced societies, or something else entirely, is less important than recognizing that it existed. Fragmentation is not merely historical, it is ongoing. Each generation inherits selectively, forgets unintentionally, and builds confidently atop partial ground. The world continues to function, but explanation lags behind experience. Perhaps this is the true legacy of inheritance, not loss of knowledge alone, but normalization of incompleteness. Humanity learns to live comfortably inside fragments, calling them whole, and yet the fragments still align imperfectly. Edges still suggest shapes beyond themselves. From time to time, they catch the light in ways that hint at a larger design, one that hasn't vanished entirely, but waits, dispersed across memory, stone, story, and silence. As fragments harden into tradition, a new force enters quietly. Revision. Not the crude erasure of memory, but its careful refinement. Stories are not destroyed, they are edited. Names remain, but meanings shift. What once described processes becomes doctrine. What once implied limitation becomes omnipotence. The past is not denied, it is corrected. This process unfolds most clearly within organized religion. Early myths are fluid, contradictory, and unembarrassed by uncertainty. Gods argue, decisions change, outcomes are revised. These inconsistencies reflect memory under strain, not philosophical failure. Yet as institutions grow, inconsistency becomes intolerable. Authority requires coherence. The solution is simplification. Complex divine councils are compressed into singular wills. Administrative disputes become moral narratives. Withdrawal is reframed as transcendence. The gods did not leave, they ascended. They did not stop intervening, they began working invisibly. Absence is transformed into presence beyond question. This transformation serves stability. A god who once negotiated can be misunderstood. A god who once failed can be doubted. A god who once required assistance undermines hierarchy. Perfection is safer. Omniscience cannot be argued with. In this way, theology becomes an architecture designed to withstand forgetting. It preserves reverence while discarding vulnerability. It maintains authority while obscuring origin. The cost is subtle, but significant. The loss of historical texture. Early accounts that frame humanity as labourers are softened. Work becomes punishment or test, not function. Creation stories centre humanity emotionally rather than operationally. The world becomes a stage for moral drama rather than a system requiring maintenance. This moralization changes how catastrophe is understood. Floods become judgments rather than resets. Collapse becomes punishment rather than recalibration. The possibility that disaster might be structural, not ethical, is diminished. Responsibility shifts inward, toward guilt and obedience. Such reframing is powerful. It aligns human behaviour with institutional goals. If suffering is punishment, then compliance is protection. If disorder is sin, then authority is salvation. History becomes a lesson rather than an inquiry. Over time, this revised history becomes self-reinforcing. Texts are canonized, alternatives are labelled heretical. Memory narrows. What once existed as a spectrum of accounts is reduced to a single approved narrative. Complexity is preserved only as metaphor. The irony is that this process often claims to defend truth. Revision is justified as clarification, purification, or divine guidance. Yet what is clarified is not understanding, but control over meaning. The past becomes a resource managed by the present. This management extends beyond religion. Empires adopt similar strategies. They curate history to legitimize rule. They emphasize continuity with sacred origins, while suppressing disruptive details. Rebellion becomes deviation from destiny. Innovation becomes threat. In such environments, questioning origins is dangerous. It destabilizes authority by revealing contingency. If systems were built, they can be rebuilt. If gods once argued, authority can be debated. Revision prevents these realizations by sealing the past. Yet traces resist sealing. Older texts survive in fragments. Marginal myths persist. Inconsistencies leak through. Giants linger at the edges of doctrine. Fallen beings appear inexplicably. Forbidden knowledge recurs in whispers. These are not accidents. They are pressure points where memory strains against revision. Scholars often encounter these tensions when comparing traditions. Stories that should align do not. Timelines overlap awkwardly. Roles contradict. Rather than resolving these discrepancies, institutions often absorb them into allegory. Meaning is preserved at the expense of specificity. This strategy works until it doesn't. When allegory becomes too flexible, belief weakens. When doctrine contradicts lived experience, doubt grows. Each revision stabilizes in the short term, but accumulates pressure beneath the surface. If humanity inherited a world once ruled by others, then religious revision may represent an attempt to reconcile that inheritance with autonomy, to replace lost administrators with perfect overseers, to convert technical absence into moral presence. This replacement is psychologically effective. A silent God who sees all is easier to obey than a silent system that explains nothing. Moral frameworks provide clarity where mechanics are gone. They offer purpose when function is obscure. But they also limit inquiry. Questions about origin become questions of faith. Investigation becomes transgression. Curiosity risks condemnation. The inherited system becomes untouchable not because it is understood, but because it is sacred. This sacralization of ignorance is not malicious. It is protective. It shields societies from the anxiety of not knowing. It provides meaning where explanation has failed. Yet it also freezes development, locking humanity into inherited assumptions. Modern discomfort with religion often stems from this tension. We sense that something was lost, but are offered certainty instead of recovery. We are told what to believe, not what was done. The past is presented as resolved, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Still, revision cannot erase everything. It cannot remove the feeling that myths once pointed to operations rather than ethics, that gods once managed rather than judged, that humanity once functioned within a system rather than beneath a command. These feelings surface as unease, as fascination with forbidden texts, as attraction to heretical ideas, as the sense that history is incomplete not because it is ancient, but because it has been filtered. If revision shaped the memory of inheritance, then what we call religion may be less about revelation and more about adaptation, a way to live within a world whose original logic has been obscured, without confronting the full extent of that loss. In this light, faith is not deception. It is survival, a method of coherence when integration is impossible. Yet even survival strategies leave traces of what they replaced, and sometimes in those traces the outline of a different past becomes visible, not as a contradiction to belief, but as a reminder that belief itself may be built atop something older, quieter, and far less absolute than it now appears. As memory thins and revision settles into doctrine, a final abstraction emerges. The Anunnaki cease to be figures, names, or even gods in the familiar sense. They become a category, a placeholder for something that no longer fits human language. Not a species, not a pantheon, but a role once occupied and now vacant. This transformation is subtle. It does not announce itself. It unfolds as stories grow less specific. Early texts describe individual beings with duties, rivalries, limitations. Later traditions preserve the names but strip away context. What remains is function without form, authority without embodiment. In this state, the Anunnaki no longer need to have existed physically to matter. Their presence is structural. They explain why order feels inherited rather than invented, why law feels older than lawgivers, why systems appear before explanation. The Anunnaki become shorthand for prior organization. This abstraction solves a problem. Concrete beings invite questions. Where did they come from? Where did they go? Abstract categories do not. They occupy a conceptual space beyond inquiry. They allow continuity without accountability. Across cultures, similar abstractions appear. Watchers, ancestors, architects, first ones, culture bringers. The names differ, but the role is consistent. They establish, they instruct, they depart. Humanity remains. The departure is key. If these figures stayed, history would continue to be interactive. Their absence forces reinterpretation. Over time, reinterpretation replaces memory. The Anunnaki are no longer remembered as managers, but as principles. Order itself becomes divine. This shift reshapes human self-understanding. If the Anunnaki are no longer beings, then humanity cannot imagine replacing them. There is no role to inherit fully, only to approximate. The world becomes something to obey rather than comprehend. This obedience is not necessarily imposed, it is internalized. Humans sense limits they cannot articulate, boundaries that feel real but undefined. Progress accelerates in some directions, while stalling inexplicably in others. Certain questions feel unaskable, not because they are forbidden, but because they lack conceptual footing. Modern language reflects this inheritance. We speak of systems as if they possess intention. The market decides. History demands. Nature corrects. Agency migrates away from individuals into abstractions. Responsibility diffuses. This diffusion mirrors ancient patterns. Where once gods decided, now systems do. The names change. The logic remains. Humanity adapts to forces it does not fully understand, managing outcomes without grasping origins. The Anunnaki as category also resolve a deeper tension. They allow humanity to acknowledge that something preceded us without committing to what it was. They preserve humility without specificity, mystery without obligation. This may explain why attempts to literalize them provoke discomfort. Physical interpretations threaten abstraction. They reintroduce contingency. If the Anunnaki were something concrete, then they could be studied, compared, perhaps even understood. Abstraction protects distance. Yet abstraction carries cost. It erases detail. It flattens history. It makes all origins interchangeable. When everything becomes symbolic, nothing can be tested. Inquiry dissolves into belief. Still, traces of concreteness persist. Early descriptions linger awkwardly within later frameworks. Administrative language embedded in myth. Labour assignments disguised as moral lessons. Councils reduced to singular will. These remnants feel out of place because they belong to a different mode of memory. The category strains under its own weight. It must explain too much with too little. As science advances, new categories emerge to replace old ones. Evolution, emergence, complexity. These terms perform similar work. They acknowledge prior order without specifying origin. This convergence is not accidental. Humanity repeatedly creates abstractions when faced with inherited complexity. It is a coping mechanism, a way to function without integration. If humanity inherited a world once ruled by others, then abstraction is the final stage of that inheritance. First there was direct interaction, then memory, then ritual, then doctrine, finally category. At this stage the Anunnaki are no longer remembered. They are assumed. Their role is embedded in expectation itself. The world feels structured because it is supposed to be. Questioning that assumption feels unnecessary, even disruptive. Yet unease remains. Abstractions do not satisfy curiosity. They stabilize, but they do not explain. They suppress questions rather than answer them. Beneath them, fragments still whisper of specificity. Occasionally those whispers align. Texts resonate, myths overlap. Structures echo. For a moment the abstraction thins and the outline of something more concrete appears. Not clear enough to define, but distinct enough to unsettle. This unsettling is often dismissed as speculation. Yet speculation arises precisely where explanation is incomplete. It is not failure of reason, but signal of absence. The Anunnaki as category represent the boundary of inherited understanding. Beyond them lies the possibility that history did not begin with humanity, but continued through it, that we are not first but not last. That order existed, withdrew, and left behind a world capable of running without knowing why. If that is so, then the category is not the end of inquiry. It is its pause, a moment where language stops because memory cannot proceed further without risk. And in that pause, humanity continues, naming, organizing, abstracting, living inside a system whose deepest origins have become indistinguishable from the structures that replace them, waiting quietly for the moment when abstraction no longer suffices. If the Anunnaki became a category rather than a presence, then what remains as their most persistent trace may not be found in stone, text, or ritual, but in the human mind itself. Not as memory, but as orientation. Consciousness, in this view, is not merely an evolutionary accident. It is a legacy interface, shaped to interact with a world already structured, already constrained. Early myths hint at this obliquely. Humans are said to receive breath, word, or spark from higher beings. These gifts do not grant power outright. They grant awareness, the ability to perceive order, to recognize patterns, to anticipate cycles. Yet they are paired with limits. Knowledge is partial. Vision is bounded. Curiosity carries risk. This pairing's telling. A tool designed for use rather than mastery would look exactly like this, capable of navigating complexity, but not of redesigning it. Consciousness becomes adaptive rather than authoritative. It senses alignment and misalignment without necessarily knowing why. Modern neuroscience reveals something similar. The human brain excels at pattern recognition, narrative construction, and predictive modeling. It fills gaps instinctively. It imposes coherence on incomplete data. This is useful in an inherited system where full information is unavailable. Survival depends not on total understanding, but on plausible interpretation. Yet this same capacity makes humans vulnerable to illusion. We see intention where there is none. We attribute agency to systems. We construct meanings that stabilize behavior even when they are incorrect. Consciousness becomes both guide and veil. If humanity inherited a world once ruled by others, then such a mind would be ideal. It would allow continuity without comprehension, participation without authorship. Humans could operate within the system, maintain it, even extend it marginally, without challenging its foundations. This would explain why so many ancient traditions emphasize altered states of consciousness: trance, dream, vision, ritual intoxication. These are not escapist practices. They are attempts to tune perception differently, to access layers of awareness that feel closer to origin. In these states, humans report contact with teachers, watchers, ancestors, guides. Whether interpreted spiritually or psychologically, the consistency is notable. Consciousness seems capable of entering modes where the inherited structure feels more explicit, more navigable. Yet these modes are unstable. They cannot be sustained. They do not translate cleanly into daily life. Whatever access they provide is fleeting. The system allows glimpses, not residence. This limitation reinforces the idea of consciousness as a regulated interface. Certain thresholds can be approached but not crossed. Too much insight destabilizes identity. Too much awareness dissolves social cohesion. The mind protects itself by returning to narrative. Over time, cultures formalize this protection. Mystical experiences are codified. Visionaries are controlled. Revelation becomes regulated. Consciousness is channeled back into doctrine. The interface is narrowed again. Still, the impulse persists. Humans continue to ask questions that exceed utility. Why are we here? Why does the world feel ordered? Why does meaning seem imposed rather than chosen? These questions do not improve survival directly. They reflect orientation, not advantage. Perhaps this orientation is itself inherited, a subtle calibration towards something absent. Consciousness as a compass whose north no longer exists, but whose needle still points. Modern technology amplifies this tension. As humans build increasingly complex systems, they replicate the conditions of inheritance. Users operate tools they do not fully understand. Algorithms decide outcomes without transparency. Systems behave as though intentional. In response, humans anthropomorphize. We speak of machines learning, networks deciding, systems wanting. This language echoes ancient abstraction. Once again, agency migrates upward, away from individuals. This recursion suggests continuity rather than coincidence. Humanity recreates inherited patterns because consciousness is shaped to do so. We build worlds that resemble the one we inherited. Layered, opaque, powerful, partially comprehensible. And just as before, meaning follows. Ethics arise to manage behavior within systems. Myths emerge to explain complexity. Authority consolidates to stabilize uncertainty. Consciousness adapts, but does not escape. If the Anunnaki left behind not instructions, but orientation, then consciousness is their most enduring artifact. Not knowledge of who they were, but of how to function in their absence. A mind tuned for maintenance, not origin. This does not diminish humanity, it reframes it. We are not failures for lacking total understanding. We are successful inheritors, capable of survival, adaptation, and limited creation within constraints we did not set. Yet the cost of this success is longing. Consciousness senses that something is missing, even when it cannot define it. This longing fuels philosophy, art, science, and religion. It drives exploration beyond necessity. Perhaps this is why no answer ever fully satisfies. Each explanation closes some questions and opens others. Integration remains just out of reach. The system responds but never resolves. If consciousness is a legacy tool, then its restlessness is intentional. It keeps humanity moving without allowing stagnation or dominance. It encourages curiosity without granting closure. In this light, the greatest inheritance is not the world itself, but the tension embedded within awareness. The sense of standing inside something vast, functional, and unfinished. The intuition that meaning exists but not in full view. And so consciousness continues its quiet work, navigating fragments, weaving narratives, sensing alignment, filling gaps. Not as a master of the world, but as its attentive caretaker. If there was once an intelligence that structured this inheritance, it may no longer be present. But its design persists in the shape of human thought itself. And as long as that thought turns toward questions it cannot fully answer, the inheritance remains active, unresolved, compelling, and gently incomplete. As modern science turns its gaze outward and inward at once, it begins to circle questions that ancient myths once held quietly. Not in the language of gods or inheritance, but in equations, models, and probabilities. The tone is different, but the unease is familiar. The universe appears ordered beyond necessity. Laws emerge that feel discovered rather than invented. Reality behaves as though it follows instructions written long before observation. Physics, at its deepest levels, no longer resembles machinery. It resembles rule sets. Fields replace objects. Relationships matter more than substance. Space bends. Time stretches. Information behaves like a conserved quantity. These are not intuitive revelations. They resist common sense, yet they persist across experiments with relentless consistency. This consistency provokes an old discomfort in new form. Why should reality be intelligible at all? Why should the human mind, shaped for survival within a narrow ecological band, be capable of modelling phenomena far beyond its scale? This question is often treated as philosophical, but its implications are structural. Some physicists describe the universe as fine-tuned. Fundamental constants appear, balanced within narrow ranges that permit complexity. A slight deviation, and stars fail to form. Chemistry collapses, life never stabilizes. Explanations range from multiverses to brute necessity, yet none dissolve the strangeness. The system works, but its origin logic remains opaque. Cosmology deepens the pattern. The universe does not begin smoothly, it inflates violently. Structure emerges earlier than expected. Galaxies form before models predict stability. Order appears where randomness should dominate. Each discovery sharpens the sense that reality behaves less like chaos settling into form, and more like form expressing itself through chaos. Biology echoes this tension. Evolution explains adaptation, but not inevitability. Consciousness arises repeatedly as complexity increases. intelligence converges. Similar solutions appear independently across unrelated lineages. Life does not wander aimlessly through possibility space. It explores constrained pathways, as if guided by attractors rather than chance. Information theory enters quietly, reframing reality itself. The universe can be described in terms of computation, states update, systems process inputs. Entropy governs flow. In this view, matter is secondary. Information is primary. The universe behaves like a running program, though no code is visible. This language would have been unthinkable centuries ago, yet it resonates uncomfortably with ancient intuition. A world governed by rules, a reality maintained by processes, a system that functions independently of its observers. The question returns in modern form: did these rules emerge, or were they set? Science hesitates to ask directly. Purpose feels unscientific. Design implies intention. Yet the alternatives, necessity without explanation, randomness without constraint, remain unsatisfying. Some propose self-organization, emergence from complexity. But emergence itself becomes another abstraction. It describes behavior without origin. It explains how, not why. At the same time, artificial intelligence advances rapidly. Machines learn patterns, generate language, make decisions. They operate within architectures designed by humans, yet their behavior increasingly exceeds direct understanding. Even their creators struggle to explain outcomes. This creates an unsettling mirror. Humans now interact with systems they built but cannot fully comprehend. Agency diffuses. Responsibility blurs. Explanations retreat into abstraction. We say the system decided, the model learned, the network optimized. In doing so, humanity reenacts its own inheritance. We become the architects who withdraw, leaving systems to operate autonomously. Future users may not know why outcomes occur, only that they do. This recursion reveals something fundamental about intelligence within layered systems. Builders rarely anticipate the consequences of complexity. Over time, operation replaces understanding. Science confronts this limit repeatedly. Models predict accurately without offering intuitive clarity. Equations work even when interpretation fails. Success does not guarantee comprehension. This is not failure. It is boundary. Like ancient rituals preserved without context, modern formulas may outlast the frameworks that birthed them. They function, but they do not explain themselves. In this light, modern science does not invalidate ancient speculation. It reframes it. Where myths spoke of gods and inheritance, science speaks of laws and emergence. Both acknowledge a structured reality that precedes human explanation. The difference lies in posture. Ancient cultures personalize the unknown. Modern science depersonalizes it. Yet both confront the same silence at the foundation. If humanity inherited a world once ruled by others, then science may represent a slow return toward origin. Not through memory, but reconstruction. We rebuild understanding piece by piece, knowing coherence exists beneath fragments, but reconstruction has limits. Without original context, some insights remain asymptotic, approached, never reached. The system responds but does not reveal its source. Perhaps this is why the most profound scientific minds express humility. The more they learn, the more provisional conclusions become. Certainty shrinks as scope expands. The universe feels less conquered, more negotiated. In this convergence, ancient myth and modern science meet quietly. Both recognize that reality is not authored by humanity. It is inherited, structured, responsive, indifferent to belief. Whether that structure arose from necessity, intelligence, or something beyond language remains unresolved. What matters is the recognition that humanity did not invent the rules it follows. It discovered them mid-operation. And so humanity continues, confident enough to act, humble enough to doubt, still navigating a world that feels inherited rather than made, listening not for answers, but for orientation within a system that continues to function without explaining why. There is a fear that runs quietly beneath the long arc of human history, more persistent than fear of death, more subtle than fear of gods. It is the fear of remembering too much, not learning, not discovery, but recollection. The sudden return of something that was set aside for a reason no longer remembered. This fear does not announce itself openly. It disguises itself as caution, as reverence, as humility. Ancient warnings against forbidden knowledge are often read as moral lessons, but they carry a different texture beneath the surface. They do not describe evil curiosity. They describe destabilization, a world that cannot absorb certain truths without breaking. Across cultures, there are thresholds that must not be crossed, names that must not be spoken, questions that dissolve identity, knowledge that brings exile rather than empowerment. These boundaries feel less like ethical limits and more like structural ones, as though certain understandings are incompatible with the system as it currently exists. If humanity inherited a world already in motion, then remembering too much would threaten that inheritance. Full recollection would expose contingency. It would reveal that what feels eternal was once provisional, that what appears natural was engineered, that what demands obedience once required maintenance. Such realizations do not simply change beliefs. They alter orientation. They destabilize authority, ritual, identity. A society organized around inherited systems cannot easily survive the awareness that those systems were designed, revised, and abandoned before. This may explain the recurring pattern of suppression, not only by institutions but by culture itself. Dangerous knowledge is not always destroyed. It is buried, fragmented, scattered across myth, symbol, and taboo. Preserved just enough to survive but not enough to integrate. The figure of the forbidden teacher appears again and again. One who brings fire, language, metallurgy, writing, astronomy. One who lifts the veil too quickly. Their fate is consistent. Exile, punishment, binding, erasure. The lesson is not that knowledge is evil, but that timing matters. Humanity is not ready to remember everything at once. Even philosophy reflects this hesitation. The deepest questions are often deferred. Why is there something rather than nothing? What grounds the laws of nature? Why does order exist at all? These questions are acknowledged, then politely set aside. They are treated as limits rather than invitations. Science, too, reveals this boundary. It advances rapidly, yet avoids certain interpretations. Purpose is excluded by definition. Origin is reframed as initial condition. Questions of why are translated into how. This is methodological prudence, but it also functions as containment. Remembering too much would collapse the distance between user and system. It would demand responsibility for structures humanity did not create. It would challenge the comfort of obedience and the relief of inevitability. This challenge is not abstract. Societies that confront foundational myths too directly often fracture. Authority weakens, meaning destabilizes. Competing narratives proliferate. Without shared orientation, coordination becomes difficult. The system wobbles. Thus, forgetting becomes adaptive. Not ignorance, but selective amnesia. Humanity remembers enough to function, forgets enough to survive. The balance is delicate. Too much forgetting leads to stagnation. Too much remembering leads to collapse. This balance may explain why rediscovery feels cyclical. Knowledge surfaces, threatens order, is absorbed, neutralized, or reburied. Each generation pushes slightly further, then recoils. Progress advances in spirals, not lines. Modern culture experiences this tension acutely. Information is abundant. Archives expand. The past becomes searchable. Ancient texts re-emerge. Comparative mythology reveals overlaps once invisible. Technology accelerates pattern recognition beyond narrative comfort. As a result, old questions resurface with new force. Were ancient myths encoding something real? Did civilizations rise before memory? Is humanity repeating a script rather than writing one? These questions unsettle because they threaten the story of origin as ascent. The fear is not that the answers are frightening. It is that they are plausible, that remembering too much would reveal continuity where we assumed novelty, that progress might be recursion, that innovation might be reassembly. If humanity once functioned within a larger framework, then full remembrance would raise an impossible question. What is our role now? Caretakers? Successors? Or merely occupants of a system that no longer needs designers? This uncertainty is destabilizing. It erodes narratives of destiny. It undermines exceptionalism. It replaces purpose with stewardship. Such a shift requires maturity, not easily sustained across entire civilizations. Thus, remembrance is rationed, allowed in art, myth, speculation, discouraged in governance, education, identity. The system protects itself by controlling how much of its own past it can bear. Yet fear cannot fully suppress curiosity. Remnants continue to surface. Ruins that do not fit timelines, texts that resist harmonization, discoveries that challenge linear development. Each anomaly presses gently against the boundary of remembrance. The boundary holds, but it flexes. Humanity edges closer to questions once deemed unaskable, not because it is braver, but because the system itself is changing. Complexity increases. Global coordination tightens. Old frameworks strain. Perhaps remembering too much was once dangerous because the system required ignorance to function. Perhaps now the danger lies in forgetting too much, in maintaining narratives that no longer align with lived reality. If the world humanity inherited is evolving beyond its original constraints, then remembrance may no longer be optional. The fear that once protected stability may now inhibit adaptation. Yet the transition will not be dramatic. There will be no sudden revelation, no unified awakening. Remembering too much does not happen all at once. It arrives gradually, as discomfort, as doubt, as the quiet realization that the stories no longer fully explain the structures we inhabit. In this moment, humanity stands between two risks: to remember too much too quickly and fracture, or to remember too little for too long and stagnate. The fear remains, but it is changing. It is no longer fear of remembering. It is fear of what happens if we never do. And so the past continues to press softly against the present, not demanding recognition, not offering certainty, but inviting a careful, unsettling question. How much of what we call history is forgotten by necessity? And how much is waiting, patiently, for a world stable enough to remember it again? At the far edge of this long inquiry, what remains is not an answer, but a landscape. Not a conclusion, but a vantage point from which the world looks different than it once did. The idea that humanity inherited a world once ruled by others does not demand belief. It invites orientation, a way of standing inside history that changes how silence, structure, and continuity are perceived. From this vantage, the world no longer feels entirely new. Cities rise where cities have risen before. Laws echo older laws. Systems repeat patterns regardless of the names assigned to them. Progress continues, but it curves. Innovation advances, yet it seems guided by constraints that were never negotiated. The future unfolds along channels carved long ago. Ruins become more than remnants of failure. They become punctuation marks, places where a sentence ended abruptly, and another began without introduction. A broken city is not only a collapsed society, but a transfer point. Knowledge did not vanish there. It thinned. Authority did not end. It relocated. Memory did not disappear. It reorganized. Seen this way, humanity does not live at the beginning of history, nor at its end, but inside it. Inside a process that renews without fully resetting. Each civilization inherits both material and orientation, stone and story, law and longing, tools and taboos. What is carried forward is not chosen entirely, it is what survives collapse. The sense that something is missing, something foundational, yet unnamed, becomes less troubling from this angle. Absence is no longer failure. It is condition. Every inherited system contains blind spots. Every world handed down arrives incomplete. Expecting total understanding may itself be the anomaly. This perspective reframes responsibility. If humanity is not the original architect, then dominance is misplaced. The role shifts from conqueror to custodian. The question is no longer how to extract maximum value from the world, but how to maintain coherence within it. How to operate without destabilizing what cannot yet be repaired. This does not diminish human agency. It clarifies it. Agency exists within limits, not beyond them. Creativity flourishes not by rewriting the rules of reality, but by learning how they bend. Wisdom emerges not from mastery, but from alignment. In this light, the ancient warnings feel less oppressive. Boundaries were not imposed to restrict growth, but to prevent collapse. Silence was not meant to deceive, but to preserve continuity when explanation was impossible. Forgetting was not betrayal, but adaptation. Modern humanity stands at a threshold similar to those faced before. Complexity accelerates. Systems interlock globally. Feedback loops tighten. Small disruptions scale rapidly. The inherited world feels more sensitive, more reactive. The margin for error narrows. This sensitivity may be the clearest sign of inheritance. A world built from scratch tolerates experimentation. A world layered across epochs demands care. Every adjustment ripples outward. Every decision echoes backward. The temptation in such moments is certainty. Final answers, singular explanations, clear villains or saviours. Yet history suggests that certainty hardens too quickly. It fractures under pressure. What endures is flexibility, humility, and attentiveness to patterns rather than proclamations. If there were once rulers, whether understood as gods, intelligences, or prior civilizations, their absence now defines the human condition. Not as abandonment, but as invitation. The invitation is not to reclaim their place, but to learn how to live without it. This learning is uneven. Some societies pursue control, others pursue balance. Some accelerate, others conserve. None fully escape inheritance. All negotiate it differently. The future, from this vantage, is not a destination. It is a continuation. Another layer laid atop foundations already weathered by time. What matters is not whether humanity will one day uncover definitive proof of those who came before. Proof may change little. What matters is whether humanity can remain responsive to the structures it did not choose, but must maintain. There is a quiet dignity in this role. To live within a system larger than oneself without demanding authorship. To steward what cannot yet be explained. To resist the urge to simplify complexity into certainty. As night falls on this long reflection, the world does not feel empty of meaning. It feels full of it, distributed, unevenly, embedded in stone, encoded in ritual, implied by law, hinted at by science. Meaning is not missing, it is dispersed. Perhaps this dispersion is intentional, a safeguard against concentration, a way to ensure that no single era, no single species, no single mind holds total authority over reality. Understanding must be collective, incremental, and provisional. If so, then humanity's inheritance is not a burden to overcome, but a responsibility to inhabit well, to listen where silence persists, to question without demanding closure, to build without forgetting that we are building atop something older. The world continues to function. The systems continue to respond. History continues to layer itself quietly beneath our feet. And as humanity moves forward, carrying fragments, shaping narratives, adjusting structures, it does so not as the first intelligence to walk this terrain, nor as the last, but as one chapter in a much longer process. A process that does not announce its origin or promise its end. The stones remain, the patterns persist, the questions endure. And perhaps that is enough, not to resolve the mystery, but to live attentively within it, aware that the world we inhabit was never entirely ours, yet remains for now entrusted to us.